After the death of the Buddha, Buddhism hit a crossroads with monks arguing what the correct path was for Buddhism and what the Buddha meant in his sermons. This gave way to the first of three councils that was held, and they were known as three baskets. The basket one is the basket of disclosures. This contained the teachings and sermons of the Buddha. The second basket is a basket of monastic discipline, containing the history and rules of the Sangha. The third basket is the basket of higher teachings, containing scholastic treatises analyzing the Buddha's teachings. The third council was born around 350 BCE, and it was called the Great Schism between the elders and the monks. It was also known as the Great Assembly. Schism means the splitting of the Sangha. The first split was between the elders and the monks, as stated before. And the split was with concern of the preservation of certain scriptures. Williams said, "We know that from an early time there were specialists in the Santraka and the Vinaya. With the time, the Sutraka, for example, also tended to divide into groups specializing in particular sections of the Sutra canon. With the rise of the Abhidharma as a systematic analysis of the totality into its constituents, there undoubtedly followed groups of monks specializing in the philosophical analysis, fragmentation of everyday world into its ultimately or finally real elements." So the sutras did not respect and rejected the Abhidharma, furthering the opposition of the two groups. And some monks were specialists in the doctrine of the Buddha's teachings. Others were noted as teachers who were specialists in other teachings, and those named schools after themselves. We hear in the canon of personal disciples of the Buddha who were noted for their attainments in particular branches of the doctrine. Thus, we reference to Sariputta as the great philosophical analysis and specialist in the Vinaya. So that created a difference in rules. And seeing that the Buddha himself was known to be flexible on them, certain monks had more liberty than others. And Buddhist monasticism became more complex, wealthy, and socially more closely integrated into the Indian lay society and the ascetic backlash. An appeal to the virtues and even the necessities of such additional practices, such as always wearing robes made from rags from the rubbish heap. To be a good or serious Buddhist monk may have been an important factor in the rise of Mahayana itself. Another issue was that the Buddha also taught and wrote the Dharma in the local language rather than the pan-Indian Sanskrit, and this created vast misunderstandings and differences in traditions. Arhats created, speaking of ignorance and craving ceases and meditation that leads to nirvana. And back to the schism, it occurred over discipline and what some monks were not following for the Vinaya rules. A big problem was monks were accused of handling money, which was against the quote policy given, and the money was given to them by the laymen. The Mahayana Sutras were the product of monks whose vision of the Dharma embraced the possibility of lay practice at the superior level of a bodhisattva on the path to Buddhahood, and who used lay figures in the sutras to embody a critique of other monks seen in some way defective in the light of the message of the sutra, or having lost the real message and direction of the Dharma altogether. Another council was created and cast out these monks. Yet in their subordinates, it said they created their own council and faded away from the orthodox body. Not only creating their own council, they created scriptures and altered the canon. And there is great speculation about this between the Theravada and Mahayana accounts. In other accounts, the 5 points were debated in the council and were accepted by the majority, hence the name Mahayana. Those who adhere to the great Sangha, that is the majority. The monks who refused to accept the majority decision subsequently named themselves Stravadanians. Thus, according to this account, this is where the Mahayana come from. What is certain is that the Mahayana had nothing to do with the lax monks in the council, and while everyone knew of them, not many people were very appreciative of them. Mahayana Buddhism came about with the most help of the lay people. Another explanation of the split was an advance by earlier scholars that was caused by an attempt by the Mahayana to introduce additional rules which the other party refused to accept. Again, this is controversial, seeing that it was not recognized by the Theravada, and the Mahayana stated that this is how it basically went down. Mahayana's creation can be explained best as doctrinal widening and the correct path to enlightenment. The developed Mahayana represents, at least in part, a coming to self-awareness of these currents of thought. We see in the creation of the corpus of Mahayana sutras the development of a new religious system that eventually could be used to render those currents doctrinally orthodox and respectable. So this caused Buddhism to split into two main schools, the Theravada and Mahayana. The Theravada being the original form of Buddhism that dominated the religion for a majority of the time. They believed you must find enlightenment and become an arhat, and this came without responsibilities to others. And this is why Theravada Buddhism is thought of as a more conservative form of Buddhism. The word Mahayana is usually translated as the great vehicle. The word Ma means great, but the yana is a bit trickier. It can mean both vehicle and way. Mahayana believes that once a person is close to reaching enlightenment, they must become a bodhisattva and help others find enlightenment. So unlike Theravada, Mahayana believes that once you are close to enlightenment, you must hold off your enlightenment and help others find their way to nirvana. And this is why Mahayana is seen as a more liberal approach to Buddhism. While Mahayana Buddhism still focused on the overall idea of mainstream Buddhism, it differed and created its text for the idea it is not necessarily about personal enlightenment, but to help others find their way to nirvana. There are a couple scriptures of the Mahayana Buddhism, and one is known as the perfection of wisdom. Mahayana Buddhism uses additional new text, revelations, and teaching and does not rely exclusively on the old scriptures. Another scripture, and this one is rather controversial, seeing it is not talked about because it was not translated into English, and this was the Yugra. Of the hundreds of Buddhism texts that have come to be classified as Mahayana Sutras, the inquiry of this text has been one of the most influential. The text was among the first Buddhism sutras to be transmitted from India to China, and according to traditional catalogs, it was translated into Chinese no fewer than 6 times between the 2nd and 5th centuries. The origin of Mahayana is both complicated and non-complicated. The idea itself is not complicated, meaning what Mahayana represents and how it was overall established. The part that's complicated is many texts were lost. The timing of its origin is not well known. And Buddhism spread due to political turmoil with King Asoka. Later was impacted by the trade routes from land and the sea. Prosecutions of monks due to handling money and other aspects did not help Buddhism's cause overall. Yet with the trade routes and the average people keeping the oxygen in the fire, it never truly died.